It's really an enormous pleasure for me to moderate this discussion on globalization, the COVID-19 pandemic, and supply chains. As Safwan Masri indicated, I think we're joined by three extraordinary experts. Martin Wolf is Chief Economics Editor for the FT, and he has also been a Columbia and SIPA Global Fellow, for which I'm very grateful, and the author of numerous books. And let me thank you, Martin, for the extraordinary coverage of the pandemic and its likely economic and broader effects that you are undertaking at this time, very evidence-based analysis and commentary. And Ian Bremmer, a leading thinker and commentator and advisor to companies, governments, who's really created a premier advisory firm on political risk and expanding media enterprise as well, and our own adjunct professor and teaches a hugely successful course at SIPA. Thank you, Ian. And Dr. Ruth DeFries, who's a Denning University professor, which is a very special thing at Columbia, of sustainable development, an extraordinary scholar, deeply engaged in the world, has written important essays and books, including The Big Ratchet, How Humanity Thrives in Face of Natural Crises. And I know a further book this year coming out on evolution. So thank you, Dr. DeFries. So let me just start with one or two observations. I think our discussion might usefully start with an assessment of globalization and where it's headed. And obviously we're in a period of a major shock brought on by the pandemic and now a deep global recession. And global trade has dropped significantly, but that's usually the case when economies slow. But this is also a period of growing nationalism and deep sources of geopolitical major power tension, especially between the United States and China. We've seen shocks in the past, and sometimes in the face of shocks or their aftermath, such as the Second World War, the US and the world can, turn towards greater openness and the creation of expanded international frameworks for cooperation. But the opposite is also true. We've seen countries turn inwards. And one of the frequent, I think, observations of this moment that we're in is to observe that we're seeing an acceleration of some trends. We're seeing an acceleration, for example, of digitization. And we're also seeing, I think, some acceleration of nationalism. And obviously the pandemic has created heightened concerns about vulnerabilities that come from globalization and the lack of control over supply chain. You've seen that recently in the US as we struggled to obtain adequate PPE equipment. We've seen other countries focus on food supply concerns. And in the U.S. China context, a lot of concern, not just in the pandemic, but including during this period around leading edge technology and manufacturing more broadly. But of course, very few countries come anywhere close to producing all that they need, whether they're goods or services or agriculture. And the global economy has been the foundation to global prosperity, problems notwithstanding. So I think no one is better than Martin Wolf to help us think about these challenges. Could you lead us off with some perspectives on how you see globalization today and how has the pandemic affected the future of globalization and supply chains as one instrument of that global integration network? So over to you, Martin.
So first of all, it's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this group. I've been told I have 6 minutes to deal with this discussion, but fortunately you said some of the things that I might have said. I'm going to divide my remarks into three parts. I'm going to talk about what was going on before we were hit by this, because you touched on some of that, but I can add a little. Then I will talk about what I think the impact of the pandemic is. And then finally, I will do the most daring thing and talk about the future. So the background is, and I'm focusing on globalization. So after the global financial crisis of, let's say, 2007 to 9, just give a number. The relationship in world trade and world economic output changed fundamentally. And in particularly, world trade slowed sharply relative to world output, which also slowed. So world trade has been growing much more slowly since the financial crisis than before. And in that context, among other things, it's pretty clear that supply chain unbundling across borders slowed very considerably, and in fact has continued to do so. So the great episode of globalization from, say, let's say 1980 really ended with the financial crisis. In the more recent past, the last 4 years, we've also seen the emergence in that context of a trade war between the US and many of its trading partners, but above all China, and a generalized assault, again, principally coming from the US, but nobody was much on the other side, on the idea of a multilateral system in which, of course, a system of rules, culminating with essentially the closure of the appellate body of the WTO. So globalization was very sick to start with. Second, the pandemic. This is a massive economic shock. Nobody knows how long it will last, but in terms of depth and speed, this is clearly the biggest economic slump in peacetime since the Great Depression, and quite probably the biggest slump on record. Since the mid-19th century. It's above all, it's affecting more countries than ever before. In the context of this immense economic shock, with, as you said, huge falls in output and trade, a particular feature, of course, was the shortage of medical equipment, and to a lesser degree, concerns also about food. Those were the most obvious things. The main reason for that was very, very simple. We hadn't prepared for it globally, and we didn't have the production capacity to generate all the equipment that was going to be needed, the drugs, the ventilators, the masks. We didn't have the production capacity, we didn't have the stocks. We didn't have it in aggregate anywhere. In that situation of generalized shortage and panic, export restrictions were imposed by many of the countries that could produce it. This, of course, created panic, real panic, and huge problems in countries that wanted to import relevant equipment across the range, and of course often disrupted supply chains, making it very, very difficult for countries that wanted to increase capacity to actually do so if they relied to any significant degree on imported components or imported materials. So it was highly disruptive. One example of this is that 80 countries actually eliminated import barriers on medical equipment, but the export controls of supplying countries meant that this was essentially an irrelevant decision on their part. So essentially, the trade policy, export restrictions are permitted, but it was very disruptive, no doubt. By now, a lot of the supply shortages have been eliminated and the supply position looks much better. But of course, people remember this and it will affect their future decisions. Now, the future, well, it seems to me that we can view the future in terms of the mistakes we should avoid and the opportunity we can seize. The mistakes are, of course, to go in the 1930s protectionist mistake. We got a huge recession, so that everybody wants to create jobs, so they go into 1930s style protection. There's a geopolitical mistake. Everybody wants to blame somebody else for what's gone wrong. And it's pretty clear the US wants to blame China, and China in turn is going to blame the US for incompetence. This will not go well. The third mistake is what I call the self-sufficiency mistake. The idea that every country in the world has to be self-sufficient in everything, which will be immensely costly. And it's very, very clear, I can go into this much more later, will not guarantee safety. Self-sufficiency does not guarantee safety. And then there's the opportunity. Well, you've mentioned one, digital globalization, but I think there's an opportunity to think about resilience and redundancy in our systems coherently. Resilience is a public good. And there is a need, in my view, for government institutions that think about this in relationship and alongside the private sector. But finally, I think it would be a catastrophe if the conclusion we drew from this is that every country should go back to the sort of self-sufficiency so many countries tried in the 50s, particularly in the developing world, and of course in the Soviet bloc, all of which ended very, very badly. So I'm sure I've overshot, but that's how I'd like to introduce our discussion.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you one question. What do you see as the most powerful forces that would keep us from moving down that path?
Well, the thing that I have been most struck by in the last 15 years is we sort of seem to have learned to some degree from the past. So in the financial crisis, I've been thinking about this today in another context. People were very, very aware that they shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the early 30s. And that influenced very profoundly the policies that countries take, particularly central banks, fiscal authorities, the commitment, very important in the global financial crisis, not to introduce protectionism, which was by and large stuck with. Now, I think those memories are still there to some degree, but they have weakened. They have weakened because another 10 years has passed. Everybody around at that time is now dead, and politicians have changed. We have a different sort of politician, but the memory of the past is still there. And in particular, and I'll make this the last point, in most developing countries I'm aware of, that I know at all well, there's still an awareness of why they ended up going for globalization. And most of them, not all by any means, think by and large that was sensible. They did well out of it. That's not so true in the developed world because they can no longer remember, anyone in the developed world, what it's like to live in a country which has enormous barriers to trade. But in the developing world, that's still there, and that memory still counts for something. And again, I think that these historical memories are helpful in anchoring what you do in any given crisis. Experience is more telling, even if it's secondhand experience, than theory.
Thank you very much. It's enormously helpful framing. And also, I think, a wonderful segue into perhaps talking a little bit more about U.S. and China, because we've been seeing, of course, the introduction of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs. And I think there's been some learning about that, about the effects of those tariffs and where they are felt. But I'd like to invite Ian Bremmer, who's been a fantastically keen observer of world politics and political economy, and has spending a lot of time and attention on the U.S.-China relationship. You know, some scholars are observing now, for example, that the rivalry between the U.S. and China at this moment has some uncanny resemblance to tensions we've seen in history between Germany and Great Britain around economic globalization and technological innovation and sort of a state that is protected economies versus open economies. How do you see this broader globalization environment being affected by the U.S.-China relationship?
Thanks very much, Merit. And I agree very much with Martin. I think this is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. The IMF is going to come up with their update this week, their global economic outlook. They're going to downgrade significantly their expectations for both this year and for next year. You know, I think people have been playing catch up with how bad the politics and the political response has been domestically and internationally around the world in most cases to this pandemic. How geopolitically dysfunctional institutions have a hard time responding to a crisis of this scale, both on the healthcare side and the economic side, and the insecurity that comes with many political leaders as a consequence trying to balance their own domestic interests, their own political interests with a more effective response is quite disappointing in a lot of places. I'm also very excited to find out what Martin is keeping behind that red curtain. I assume he's going to reveal that at some point before the end of the panel. to answer the U.S. China question broadly, I mean, Merit, when you started off, you talked about how nationalism and populism is growing around the world. So first, a positive thing, that the one place that nationalism and populism is not growing right now is on the European continent. And that's because perhaps the single leader that has come out best from the last several months has been Angela Merkel, whose legacy was shot before this crisis hit, couldn't even put her own appointed successor, paved the way for AKK to become the next chancellor of Germany. Now she's over 80% approval. She's not been a cheerleader. She's had a fantastic both healthcare and economic response inside Germany, and also been able to take a leadership role across Europe as a whole, including real relief for the poorer, mostly Southern European states. And that has taken some of the wind out of the populist national sails across a lot of these countries. So that's some good news. But then there's some bad news, which is that that's not happening at all in the United States or China, who have in different ways mishandled this crisis significantly. And if you look at what companies are going to be doing the best coming out of this crisis, it's overwhelmingly the tech sector, where the Americans and Chinese dominate and the Europeans are virtually nowhere. And that's a problem, right? So on the one hand, you have Europe wanting to use its institutions to be more accountable, more responsible, take this crisis, use it as an opportunity not to break down, but actually build up. But the United States and China in very different position. And, you know, a lot of people in the United States are playing politics with Xi Jinping looking so strong out of this because, of course, their economy is not contracting this year. It's probably flat. Their supply chain back up and running quickly because of the ability to use a technologically empowered surveillance state to impose quarantine and mass scale testing. But this is the worst year that Xi Jinping has had since he's become president. And it's the worst year Trump has had since he's become president. And Trump is facing re-election, which is not going easily right now. And Xi Jinping is trying to get rid of term limits in 2022, allowing him to functionally be president for life. And there are a lot of senior Chinese leaders that are privately saying, not so sure that Xi should have a slam dunk for that. And I think that, look, there's not been any trust between the Americans and the Chinese for a very long time now. That's not new under Trump. That was true under Obama. But on top of that, you're now seeing politics of decoupling between those two countries, the two most important economies, most importantly on the technology side with competing systems that are fighting in a zero-sum way against each other. The cloud, Huawei on 5G, and big data and deep learning coming in two different systems, but also increasingly a lot of American corporations saying, we don't want the same manufacturing footprint for our companies that we've had historically in China. Peter Navarro, others saying that part of the bailout American companies should receive should be to ensure that jobs and capital comes to the United States, and the definition of strategic sectors in the US becoming more broad to include big pharma, to include PPE around medical supply chain, and going forward to include the vaccine as they are developed. All of this is going to intensify the conflict that we see between the United States and China. That's on top of an insecure Trump looking to lead investigations and blame the Chinese for the initial cover-up of this virus. That's on top of Xi Jinping engaging in the new national security law on Hong Kong, which also comes from a place of domestic political insecurity, pushing that right now, which is clearly going to lead to backlash, not only in Hong Kong, but more broadly internationally. We'll see in other places as well. So my belief is, despite the fact that there's a big opportunity that comes out of the world's largest common market, Europe, and the leadership we're seeing from Merkel, from von der Leyen, from Macron, and from others, unfortunately, the two largest single economies, the United States and China, are structurally moving towards much more geopolitical confrontation. I suspect we would even see that if Biden becomes president come January, but certainly the next few months are going to be particularly volatile and dangerous. And at a time, as Martin says, of the worst economic crisis of our lifetimes, you really don't want to see that kind of geopolitical backdrop.
Let me ask you one question about U.S. China. When the business community, I think, was quite positive initially about the phase one trade agreement when it was struck. I think in part because it reflected a certain cessation of tensions and a more structured way of dealing with issues, although I think there was always a certain uncertainty about whether the targets in there were realistic. But how business thinks will also affect, I think, the atmosphere around U.S.-China relations. And I'm just wondering if you have a comment about whether the shift in supply chains that's being encouraged by policy, whether it's in the U.S. or Japan, which has just incentivized, I think, a Japanese business to also think about moving elsewhere in the region. So what is your sense about business attitudes?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, business attitudes, as Martin said, don't want to see a repeat of the kinds of protectionist policies that led us into Great Depression. So they'd like to see the phase one deal stay in place, but they're not lobbying for improved China relations the way they had been 3, 5, 10 years ago. So many American CEOs I talk to are saying that they don't think they have sustainable business plans for China in the next 5 years. It's the absence of rule of law. It's the inability to have a functional judicial response. It's the amount of IP that's being ripped off. It's the cyber problems. It's the strength of Chinese competition. I mean, Hollywood 5 years ago thought their future of the world was China. They don't think that anymore. And then, they're not making the same money at the box in terms of percentages. They're being stopped on many weekends from opening movies. There's a lot of post-production censorship and necessary changes. You look at Blizzard Activision, you look at the NBA, you look at big, Facebook that was trying to lobby for, we think we can make it into China eventually. And now Mark Zuckerberg is saying, no, you've got to hit the Chinese harder. It's not every company, don't get me wrong. But I would say a solid majority of Fortune 500 US firms right now actually would lobby for stronger and tougher US policies towards China in their areas of principal interest, which is a significant change from what we would have seen even 24 months ago. And that means that if you're Trump, you don't necessarily want to get rid of the phase one deal. The senior advisors I've been talking to in the White House tell me 51-49, the deal probably falls apart by the end of by election time. But that's it's functionally a coin flip. But they're not necessarily pushing hard on that because Trump also watches the markets very closely, and the economic story is where he expects you're going to see momentum before November. They know they're not going to get that on coronavirus, especially with the potential for a second wave. But that's very different on every other issue. They actually think if they were softer on China, they'd be exposed to rightful criticism from Biden and the Dems. The harder line on China is perhaps the only major foreign policy issue that has broad bipartisan support in the United States right now. And again, in an election time, you're just going to see that intensify.
Thank you very much. Let me bring Dr. DeFries into this conversation. You have a really unique perspective on the natural world and its relationship to us humans. And you also are an expert on food systems and have thought about natural resiliency and sustainability more broadly. As you think about the natural world and interacting with the world as a whole, please share your perspectives.
Yes, thank you, Merit, and thank you to all of those who organized this collaboratory. I'd like to bring this conversation back to what we learned from the past. And by the past, I don't mean the last century or the last 2 centuries or even the last few millennia. I mean millions and millions of years of evolution. So let's go on the premise that evolution has been in place for a lot longer than human decision making, and has been able to experiment with a lot of different ways to construct supply chains and networks. So perhaps we have something useful to learn. So here, I don't know if you can see this, this is a magnolia leaf. And if you see the veins on this magnolia leaf, you see the main branch and all of these branches going off. But if you were able to look very, very closely, you would see a very intricate network of vein leaves. And maybe next time you can go outside and look at a leaf, you will see this extremely looped and intricate network of these veins. So this leaf has a supply chain problem, the same as we have in human society. Supply chains are absolutely essential for this leaf to move water and sugars, just as they are absolutely essential in human civilization to keep us secure and less subject to shocks. And we've seen the benefit of globalization and supply chains, as we've heard from our other panelists. But supply chains are also vulnerable to shocks. So what happens if an insect takes a bite out of one of these leaf veins, or if there's some kind of shock to the system? The supply chains are also vulnerable. So how did nature evolve, or evolution experiment, to balance that benefits from supply chains and risks from supply chains? So if you look at very finely at these leaf veins, you will see that the way that evolution has balanced this problem is not to be completely efficient, because building all of those loops, just like building lots of chains in a supply chain, is not exactly the most efficient way, but it confers redundancy, because there are multiple ways to get from path A to path B. So what we learn from evolution is that redundant supply chains are absolutely essential. Networks to carry goods, essential. But also networks can be constructed to build more redundancy into the system. And if there's shocks in one part of the system, trade barriers or some kind of shock, then there are other options to go around. So that's what we learned from this magnolia leaf. And it's been so fascinating to watch the conversation along those very same lines, although not referring to leaf veins, but the importance of redundancies in supply chains, in businesses, and our ability to get PPE, and the danger of relying on sole sources. And where we have seen problems in the supply chains, it's been where there has not been redundancy, where there's been single source or few source suppliers. So the message I want to leave with you from this sort of left field, bringing in the learnings from leaf veins, is that globalization and supply chains, it's not an either or. It's not either full out efficient globalization or self-sufficiency. That evolution has devised a way to balance, get the benefits from you could say globalized supply chains, but also manage the risks through redundancies and multiple options. That would mean countries relying on not just one source for its food and its most essential supplies, and companies thinking about redundancy in their supply chain in case there's a problem in one part. So this is the kind of, I think that when we move forward, and we're seeing this in what we're hearing from businesses and from people who think deeply about these, is that a big learning from this shock that we are going through is about understanding our supply chains and creating redundancies, as Martin had mentioned.
Thank you very, very much. Let me ask you, you think a lot also about food systems, as you've just referenced, and clearly you've talked about redundancy. But let me just invite you to speak for a moment further, if you would, about resiliency as well as sustainability. I mean, so as you think about creating food systems, you know, for the world that needs to be fed, and you think about these elements, what's coming to you from this period?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the COVID crisis, there was a lot written about the danger to the food system, the food system supply chain, and they were very scary sounding. A lot of that has not played out to be as damaging as might have been originally anticipated, and that's a good thing. Where we have seen issues, this is in the US and even internationally, where we have seen these disruptions in the food supply chain have been in places where there's been concentration. For example, the meat packing industry. There are very few meat packing industries, locations in the US, less than 10. So because that's so highly concentrated, that's been one place that has been vulnerable. We've seen vulnerability in food banks, getting enough food, because the supply chain that feeds the retail sector is different than the supply chain that feeds the service sector, and the service sector supply chain, as we've seen all the dumping milk, has been disrupted, so that food banks, which normally receive from the retail sector, haven't been getting as much. So that's another place where we've seen these sort of non-redundancies in supply chains, is where we've seen disruption in the food system. So I agree that with what has already been said, with keeping the barriers low, the export and import restrictions really crucial to the international food supply chain, particularly for those low income food importing countries, which depend so heavily on imports. There might be a conversation to be had about whether they should be so dependent, and whether there is some benefit to getting some more redundancy into their supply chain, so we don't see food price spikes like we saw in 2008 and 2011. So the disruptions to the food supply have been, I think, where we've seen those concentrated, non-redundant food supply chains.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think I'd like to turn to some of the questions that I've gotten from the collaboratory participants all over the world. Thank you for those. And I think one cluster of questions is indeed focused directly on the question of supply chains. Mariaki Keller from Switzerland, and Yuan Zhao from Shanghai, and Jingmoon Moon from Canada, ask a cluster of questions around that essentially go to how are strong supply chains built and what actually causes them to break. And if we are worried about a breakdown, you know, is there some way to forecast what might cause them to break? And is there potential to make them more environmentally and economically sustainable as we think about a world that's going through a restructuring of global trade? So those are a few ideas around supply chains. Let me invite Martin, if you would, to speak to any one of those you'd like.
Well, this is a very big and complicated subject. Obviously, supply chains have basically been created in the era of globalization, which I tend to think of as sort of 1980 to perhaps 78 is the best start, Deng Xiaoping's reform, to 2007. After that, things already changed a lot. It's a different era. But in that period, there was a strong belief in that trade was going to grow, and there were colossal opportunities. For the first time, technologically, it was possible to unbundle very complicated supply chains across borders. We had the technology to do this in terms of communications and transport. Couldn't really operate integrated supply chains in this way before that. It was impossible in the 19th century, for example, very different pattern of trade. And we had the emergence of suppliers in China, above all, who could produce a wide range of products to specifications absolutely reliably and very, very cheaply. And this, of course, transformed world trade, and it also transformed China and economic systems. It's very clear to me, it brought a lot of benefits to both sides. But I think now, think about how this might end, as Ian has described very, very well, there's a complete breakdown in trust between the two sides. This sort of integration requires a very high level of mutual confidence among politicians, obviously, the people about them, but also business. Let's suppose you've structured your business about an operation designed like that. So there are people producing stuff for you in China, and Taiwan is actually a very important part of this too, and so is Japan. And without them, you just can't operate. I think that Apple is probably in exactly the situation. And then you realize, well, actually your government is in a Cold War anyway with these people. Well, then obviously you start thinking about restructuring the whole thing. In this context, I tend to think of, except in one or two very specific areas, we've talked medicine, pharmaceuticals, food is, I think, a different story. I don't think that the pandemic is crucial because it's breaking relationships further and making people more nervous about supply chains. But I think that sort of integration is no longer possible. Now, there are two possible, they said last point, there's so many to say. There are two possible reactions from the private sector come business here. One is, to follow what Ruth said, okay, it can't all be in China. We'll have it in lots of countries. We'll have it in Vietnam. We'll have it in Mexico. Has advantages, nice and close by. Already lots of this is being done with Mexico. And the way we diversify, we just shouldn't rely on one overwhelmingly dominant supplier, China. That would be a perfectly plausible response. And the other response is to say, actually, no, we better go home, because that's what the politicians want us to do. That's what the politics want to do. And in many respects, in the last resort, that's the safest, I think, mistake. And anyway, the question, I think, now in much of this is, will we end up with diversification of supply chains across the world in the way I envisage, or will we end up with the let's all go home? Now, the let's all go home game is basically a US specific game. No other country in the world can seriously contemplate that, but Europe might. And Ian has already touched on that possibility. So that's, I think, where we are, and that's where the politics interact with it. Just the final point, the cost benefit advantages of these countries in supplying has diminished, the cost, because their wages have risen so much and the automation has got involved. So I actually think the underlying economic drivers of a lot of the supply chain unbundling we saw are themselves also weaker.
Yeah, thank you very much. Coupled with energy, for example.
Yeah, yes, of course, of course.
Ian, Ruth, would you wish to make a further comment on this question before we move to other?
I can make a comment to the question of how we build supply chains, safe supply chains, and I think the way that we build is to experience shocks and learn from them. we can't replicate a, a shock even in the best of models. We can't really play out how the whole complex system responds to these kinds of shocks. So in terms of the food supply, we saw in 2008 and again in 2011, spikes in prices, which were very, very severe and had led to hardship for a lot of people. Part of those were caused by climate shocks in the producing places, and part of it was caused by the reaction, the export restrictions. So one of the learnings from those, I think, is how important it is to have the global conversation, which hasn't really happened. I think the others can speak more knowledgeably about how to coordinate those responses to shocks so that we learn from previous shocks, don't get into such a situation of hardship, and with each shock we learn more.
Thank you. Ian, would you have a comment, or if not, I'll take us into a direction that was raised by your remarks. But okay, and it was a very interesting and important observation I think we can all engage on, and is reflected in a question that we have from Jane Longman from Ireland, who asks, when a vaccine is found, will the world be ready to produce and distribute billions of vaccines and medical supplies, and how can companies be incentivized to develop vaccines that are affordable? And I would just add to that, and governments be incentivized to cooperate as well, since you've raised that in question. And I think all three of you will doubtless have views on that. Could you lead us into that set of observations?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest disappointment that we've seen in the last 3 months has been the interference and intervention of governments to help ensure that there isn't efficient response to this most global of crises. Now, that's not such a problem if you look at central banks, because even if they're not assertively coordinated, they all are rowing in the same direction. They have the same playbook, they kind of understand what they need to do. But when you talk about things like medical supply chain and treatments, and most importantly, vaccine. For example, President Trump has said that the United States is leaving the World Health Organization, literally in the middle of a pandemic. It would be hard to come up with a more inane policy suggestion than that. Now, to be fair, Trump doesn't actually have the authority to leave the World Health Organization. It takes a year to do. So it wasn't a very meaningful thing to say, but it reflects the fact that the United States is uninterested in cooperating in terms of sharing of data, in terms of collectively responding to put together a vaccine. Now, there are over 110 vaccines in various stages of development right now. And there are some that are trying to work together to ensure that when vaccines are created, that they will be available globally. Bill Gates, the World Health Organization, Antonio Guterres, and the EU, again, I mean, has been one of the positive stories here. The United States, absolutely not. China, absolutely not. And so, you know, if you wanted to look at why is it that I'm more pessimistic about the response to this most global of crises, it's in part because you don't have a lot of government effort to ensure that the most substantial human capital effort of our lifetimes, I mean, the fastest we've ever before gotten a vaccine for a new disease was mumps, 4 years. We desperately need this in well shorter than that. And, you know, most of the epidemiologists working on it believe that we'll get some vaccines that will be available for some frontline workers in healthcare in the middle of next year. But what you need is a global effort to find a global vaccine for a global disease. And we're not going to get that. Instead, what we're going to have, I'm fairly certain, is a pretty fragmented response with the people that are most capable of paying for it, having access to those, the majority of those vaccines for the first 6 to 12 months. And given that that vaccine, assuming it works, is what allows you to start having a new normal in your economy and getting, demand and supply and sectors that are otherwise sucking wind back up to speed, and thinking about bringing globalization, whatever the next phase of globalization looks like, to actually be there, there's going to be a massive geopolitical fight brewing over that vaccine. Interestingly, right now, it looks like the 3 vaccines that are in development that are closest, one is the Chinese-Canadian team, and the other 2 are private sector efforts, one in the United States and one in the United Kingdom. We'll see if that's what it ends up looking. And people like Bill Gates are saying that they're likely to either all work or all not work because they're using the same basic technologies. And we'll find out, in the next 3 to 6 months, a little bit more than we know right now. But this is geopolitically, this is going to be a lot worse because of that lack of alignment.
Yeah. Well, I think one, obvious feature is that we don't have institutions in the world that can manage this very well. And so you need the involvement of companies and governments and individuals, of course. I know there are some human trials going on already, including with respect to medicines that have been developed, for example, in the UK, being, I believe, at some point tested in Brazil, for example. So the human collaboration globally around discovery is there and is enormously important. I wonder if, Martin, you wish to comment further on how you see the distribution and collaboration evolving.
Well, I must stress that I am definitively not an expert in this area. So I have to be very cautious. But Ian has obviously described the broad background. We are in a deeply myopic, my country first state in the world. And obviously that means in practice that countries with scientific and technological and economic resources are likely to get there first. And they're likely to keep it for themselves first. This is quite obvious. You've got a Chinese, British, and an American effort, which is more or less what you would probably have predicted. There are but 1 or 2 that might have also been in it. So that's the first point. And none of these countries are led by people who are necessarily going to think globally. Actually, I think the most likely to think globally will be the Chinese, for the simple reason that if they come up with a vaccine that works and they can get it produced at scale for the whole world, it will be the most massive coup in terms of global reputation. And as far as I can see, the Americans don't care about that. Or at least this administration doesn't care at all about that. But Mr. Xi, I think, is more intelligent. And obviously Britain can't supply the world. So I think that the Chinese are most likely, for essentially for selfish reasons, but perfectly sensible. Now, there is 2 other thoughts that I've had on this. The one is, there is a reasonably good chance the vaccine won't work. As Ian said, producing a vaccine at this rate of speed is unprecedented. And secondly, it may have side effects we won't know about because the testing will be over such a short period. The macabre, if I like that, amusing stroke, macabre stroke, whatever you want to make it thing, is that essentially in the scenario that he described, which is the most plausible scenario, that the test will be the people of the richest countries. And what's more, the richest people in the richest countries. Well, there's a sort of brutal logic to that. These people should be the guinea pigs. And if this vaccine turns out to be fantastically dangerous, years down the pipe, they're going to find out first. The final thing is, I don't know how this is going to be handled with developing countries. I assume there will be intellectual property issues. The Americans have already made this clear, but of course, they are entitled, developing countries are entitled to force patent disclosure and force such vaccines to be produced by suppliers, for example, in India or China, and they will try to do so. And if the Americans or British, but the Americans are most likely, start really making problems about this, it would create a global scandal which will never, ever be forgotten. So are the Americans that mad? I don't know. I've given up with this administration. But there is potentially, if this is mishandled, since there are so many lives on the line here, the possibility of simply stupendous international reputation collapses.
Thank you very much. Ruth, would you care to comment on the medicine distribution or vaccine development dimension?
Well, I have no expertise in medical supply chains or vaccine development, so I'm just commenting as a citizen. And as Ian and Martin have already said, the biggest concern for me is not so much the technical side, it's the distribution and who gets access, who can afford the vaccine and who will get it first are those who can afford it. That's between countries and within countries as well. Now, if there's a risk to that, as Martin has alluded, then it's going to go the other way, that the rich are not going to be the ones to put themselves at risk. So there's a lot of if you use network science to figure out what would be the most efficient, best deployment of vaccines to stop the spread of the virus with the least amount of vaccines, you could come to a very interesting distribution of vaccines, evidence-based, science-based, and we learn a lot about that from the smallpox eradication effort. But I fear that that is not actually what the world is going to follow, as we've seen from so many issues where the science and evidence takes a backseat.
Well, thank you. Let me just inject a small note of optimism into this conversation, because I do think we are seeing an extraordinary period of scientific discovery going on at this moment, and innovation and collaborations unprecedented. You know, some things that might really change our world in a short period, you know, can happen. And even in the best of circumstances, the distribution is a huge challenge we'd have to deal with, even without that fear and inward tendency of countries to want to prioritize their own populations. But in the face of this global challenge, I think transnational collaborations that are going on in science and major investments by philanthropists and others, I think there is grounds for some optimism that there will be both discovery and collaboration that will occur. But let me now turn, we have gotten many questions, and with some assistance, I have them grouped in many fantastic areas. But first, let me thank our collaboratory participants for sending excellent questions our way. And I'm going to just choose a couple in our remaining moments, jumping around a little bit, perhaps on areas we haven't quite talked about in our conversation. And one of the clusters of questions really have to do about the impact of this crisis that we're in on developing countries. All of you have alluded to that, but you know, how is this supply chain crisis, what does it mean for Africa? Or as you think about the problems that Brazil is experiencing, is that going to have spillover effects to the rest of Latin America? These are some of the questions we're getting about developing countries, and I'd like to invite anyone who would like to start that conversation to so indicate.
Well, I'll start that conversation from the work that I do in India. So I'm deeply embedded there, and the major issue that has come to the fore is when India had the most severe lockdown strategy. And when that lockdown was put into place, what it did was the migrants, people who had gone from villages to work in the cities, they lost their livelihoods in the matter of hours. And there was the lockdown. So they couldn't get back to their villages. And this is a ongoing major crisis for people. And there are just heartbreaking, horrendous stories about people walking hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, carrying their children to get back to their villages. So that is an example of thinking about the whole system of what happens when the lockdown goes into place, the economic hardship, and particularly the populations that are affected. We see that here in the US too with the essential workers. So, building that in from the beginning, I'm not trying to second guess or say anyone made bad decisions, but some forethought about those populations which are most vulnerable and how to accommodate what is really an enormous economic and livelihood hardship with the lockdown, how that could have been considered by helping them get back home or, dealing with that population. Could have avoided an enormous hardship.
I'll take this for a couple minutes. I mean, first of all, one thing that's rewarding to see is that there are some poor countries out there that have done a fantastic job responding. So it's not as if it's just about Merkel and Ardern in New Zealand. Vietnam, for example, with great contact tracing and quarantines early. They had a lot of experience with MERS, with SARS. They put that into place. And as a consequence, they were able to bend the curve down, and their economic outlook this year is a hell of a lot stronger than it would have been otherwise. Argentina, which came into this in the worst possible environment, and yet you have President Fernandez bringing together the entire government in a non-cheerleading kind of way, saying, here's what we need to do, leading with science, putting the scientists out in front, putting the health ministers out in front, and as a consequence, his approval ratings have gone up, and Argentina's handled this better than they might have otherwise. Greece, I mean, this is a country that has had some of they've gone through a Great Depression themselves over the last decade, and yet again, very effective early stage response in lockdown and in getting the entire government rowing in the same direction. It's places where you're not politicizing. And here in the United States, we're even politicizing the wearing of masks. It's the only advanced industrial economy in the world where a question of mask wearing is being made into a patriotic one. It's insanity, right? And that's not happening in other advanced industrial democracies. But when you look at the rest of the developing world, there have also been some really big problems with really bad governance, like Brazil and Bolsonaro in particular, and Pakistan and Imran Khan in particular. And in those countries where you already don't have the money to afford long-term lockdowns, where people are living closer to subsistence already, and where you couldn't do social distancing if you wanted to, because so many people live in slums and favelas where there's gonna be all sorts of transmission. The healthcare system isn't close to adequate, and they don't have anywhere near the testing that we have in the United States or in Europe or in South Korea. All of that implies that the outbreaks that you will see as the epicenter of the virus shifts into the developing world, in those places where governance is bad, is going to be a lot worse than what we've experienced in the United States and Europe. And that's going to be compounded by the fact that we're not going to have good data around it. In the United States and Europe, at the very least, you've got a lot of localities. You can actually get good, transparent data around, do you have surge capacity for ICU beds? You're not going to have that locally in Brazil or in Pakistan. And so not only will they have the economic impact of the known virus, but they'll also have the economic and political impact from people saying, we don't trust any of this, and we're not prepared to reopen. We're not prepared to engage. It's a very serious problem that I think you're going to see playing out through 2021 at the minimum.
Thank you. May I invite Martin Wolf? We've gotten a lot of questions. Martin, you may want to make a comment on developing countries. You've written on that a lot, but I'm seeing a lot of questions also about, if the world does diversify away from China, what will be the effect on China, and what will be the effect on developed economies? And, Ian spoke a lot about U.S. China, but you have done an awful lot of work in that area as well. I wanted you to have a moment on that subject, if you wish.
So let me just comment very briefly on both. So I agree with everything that's been said on developing countries, and operating lockdowns have, for reasons Ian's mentioned, almost impossible. And I found, I have written about this, I found what the Indian government has done incomprehensible. I mean, literally incomprehensible on many dimensions. It didn't work. But I would stress the other aspect of it, because the others haven't, which is that this is a gigantic external economic shock for developing countries. It's a health shock, of course, but many developing countries are commodity exporters, and we've had a dramatic commodity price fall. Many developing countries are very dependent on tourism. Well, that isn't doing too well. Many developing countries are very dependent on remittances from migrants. Well, that, in many cases, the people who are earning those incomes are no longer earning those incomes. And of course, the lockdowns, both actual and spontaneous, have, just what citizens are doing, have damaged their economies, and they are really sort of on the edge. And then there's finally been a lot of problems with capital flow, so that's somewhat improved. But for low-income countries, also debt service problems. So this is a multiple massive shift, and it's very important for sub-Saharan Africa, particularly parts of Latin America, economically, and also not insignificant for South Asia. So it's a very big economic crisis. I mean, enormous. Now, of course, their economies are not going to decline as much as those of the developed countries, but they can't afford the cushions. There won't be the cushions. A lot of people will be in terrible shape. There are estimates of enormous increases in the absolute number of absolutely poor people. Now, on China, China was diversifying away from being a highly export-oriented economy. Its export ratio has been falling dramatically since 2008. Whole host of reasons, quite naturally. It has imported a lot of its own supply chain, so that has filled out its own economy, which has become significantly more self-sufficient. There are a lot of things it does that nobody else will be able to replicate very quickly. We've all talked about Huawei to death, but the reason Huawei is so successful is nobody else knows how to do this at this scale and these prices. So I think China will survive. This is not going to finish China. They've got other problems, but this is not. And I think it will actually create quite naturally, and I think wonderfully, opportunities for other countries. So I like this. I mean, diversification away from the old supply chains in China in some areas will give opportunities for other countries, which other countries should take if we're sensible. It will diversify production. It will spread opportunities for growth. And we should be encouraging this, and we should not be trying to make ourselves all self-sufficient, which I think will be very undesirable and very uneconomic, very costly, and extremely bad for what was an important part of the development opportunity of the last three or four decades.